The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Windsor Castle with an intensity that seemed to match the storm brewing within its ancient walls. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, stood in the dimly lit drawing room, her hands trembling as she clutched a letter that would change everything. The ornate furniture around her, pieces that had witnessed centuries of royal drama, seemed to close in as she read the words that shattered her world. The letter bore the official seal of Buckingham Palace, but its contents were far from ceremonial. It detailed a decision that had been made without her knowledge, a betrayal so profound that it left her breathless. Charles, the king she had respected and served faithfully for years, had made arrangements that would effectively diminish her role within the royal family. The plans, crafted in secret meetings she had never been invited to attend, would see many of her charitable patronages transferred to Camilla, the queen consort. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she realized the implications. Years of dedication, countless hours spent building relationships with charities, hospitals, and community organizations were being swept away with the stroke of a pen. The causes she had championed, the people who had come to trust her, would now fall under Camilla's influence. It felt like watching her life's work crumble before her eyes. The sound of footsteps echoing through the marble corridors announced an unwelcome arrival. Camilla Parker Bowles entered the room with the confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. Her lips curved into what could generously be called a smile, but Catherine recognized it for what it truly was, a smirk of satisfaction. The queen consort's eyes sparkled with an unmistakable gleam of triumph as she took in Catherine's distressed state. "My dear Catherine," Camilla said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I do hope you've had time to process the news. Change can be so difficult, especially when one has become rather attached to certain responsibilities." Catherine struggled to maintain her composure, but the tears she had been fighting began to flow freely. Each drop that fell seemed to fuel Camilla's satisfaction. The older woman moved closer, her presence filling the room with an uncomfortable tension that made the very air feel thick and oppressive. "You must understand," Camilla continued, settling herself into a velvet armchair with practiced ease, "that as queen consort, I have certain duties to fulfill. The king believes it would be more appropriate for someone of my standing to oversee these particular organizations. After all, experience does count for something in this family." The words stung like physical blows. Catherine knew that Camilla's experience consisted mainly of years of controversy and scandal that had once threatened to tear the monarchy apart. Yet here she was, using her newfound position to systematically dismantle everything Catherine had built. The irony was not lost on her. The woman who had once been seen as the greatest threat to the royal family was now being handed its most precious assets. Catherine's mind raced back to the early days of her marriage to William. She remembered the careful way she had been introduced to her royal duties, the patient guidance from Elizabeth II, who had seen something special in the young woman her grandson had chosen to marry. The late queen had personally selected many of the patronages that Catherine now faced losing, believing that her fresh perspective and genuine compassion would breathe new life into these organizations. "The Children's Hospital Charity," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking. "I've worked with them for 8 years. The patients know me, trust me. How can you just take that away?" Camilla's expression remained unmoved, though her smirk seemed to grow wider. "Oh, my dear, you make it sound so dramatic. I'm sure the children will adapt quite well to new leadership. After all, they're remarkably resilient, aren't they?" The casual dismissal of the relationships Catherine had built felt like a knife to the heart. She thought of little Emma, a 7-year-old cancer patient who had specifically requested to see Princess Kate during her treatment. There was Marcus, a teenager who had overcome a rare genetic disorder and had asked Catherine to be the first person he called when he received his acceptance letter to university. These weren't just professional relationships. They were bonds forged through shared struggles and genuine care. The mental health initiatives Catherine pressed on, her voice growing stronger despite her tears. "Those were my idea from the beginning. I've spent years researching, consulting with experts, building programs from the ground up. Yes, and I'm sure Charles appreciates all that groundwork, Camilla replied with mock gratitude. It will make the transition so much smoother for me. You've essentially provided me with a ready-made platform for my own vision. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. All her hard work, her innovative approaches to tackling mental health stigma, her carefully cultivated relationships with researchers and advocates, it had all been planned as a stepping stone for Camilla's advancement. The king had watched her pour her heart and soul into these causes, knowing full well that they would eventually be stripped away and handed to his wife. Catherine sank into a nearby chair, the weight of betrayal crushing down upon her. She had always known that royal life came with sacrifices and disappointments, but she had never imagined that her own family would orchestrate such a calculated attack on her life's work. The woman who had spent years proving herself worthy of her position was being systematically dismantled by someone whose own path to respectability had been paved with other people's pain. William doesn't know, does he? Catherine asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. Camilla's laugh was sharp and cold. Oh, my dear, William is far too busy with his environmental crusades to pay attention to such domestic arrangements. Besides, Charles felt it would be better to present this as a fait accompli rather than invite unnecessary drama. The dismissive tone with which Camilla spoke of Catherine's husband revealed the true depth of the scheme. This wasn't just about redistributing royal duties. It was about establishing a clear hierarchy within the family, with Camilla positioning herself as the ultimate authority over the female members of the royal household. Catherine realized with growing horror that this was likely just the beginning of a larger campaign to marginalize her influence and consolidate power under the queen consort's control. As if reading her thoughts, Camilla leaned forward with predatory interest. I do hope you won't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Catherine. The monarchy requires unity, and public displays of discontent would be most unfortunate for everyone involved. The threat was clear, wrapped in the polite language of royal protocol, but unmistakably menacing. Catherine understood that any resistance would be painted as selfishness or instability, potentially damaging not just her own reputation, but also reflecting poorly on William and their children. The trap had been carefully constructed, leaving her with no apparent way out that wouldn't result in collateral damage to the people she loved most. Catherine's tears continued to fall as she contemplated the cruel efficiency of the plan. Every aspect had been calculated to maximize her humiliation while minimizing the possibility of effective resistance. The timing, coinciding with a particularly challenging period in her personal life, seemed designed to catch her at her most vulnerable. The secrecy had prevented her from building alliances or preparing counter-strategies. Even the choice of venue, Windsor Castle, a place filled with memories of happier times with the royal family, added an extra layer of psychological manipulation. The women's shelter program, Catherine said desperately, grasping for something that might be spared, surely that can remain with me. It's such personal work, and the women there have shared their stories with me in confidence. Camilla's expression grew even more satisfied, as if Catherine's desperation was exactly what she had been hoping to provoke. Oh, but that's precisely why I think a fresh perspective might be beneficial. Sometimes these personal attachments can cloud one's judgment. I believe a more objective approach might yield better results. The clinical way Camilla dismissed the deeply personal relationships Catherine had formed with abuse survivors was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. These were women who had found the courage to rebuild their lives, many of whom had specifically cited Catherine's compassionate approach as crucial to their recovery. To reduce their trust and vulnerability to mere personal attachments, the clouded judgment revealed a fundamental lack of understanding about the nature of healing and support. Catherine realized that arguing was futile. Camilla had not come to negotiate or explain. She had come to gloat. The decision had already been made, the papers already signed, the announcements already prepared. This conversation was merely Camilla's opportunity to savor her victory and ensure that Catherine fully understood the new power dynamics within the royal family. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the drawing room floor, Catherine found herself thinking about all the people who would be affected by this decision. The charity workers who had spent years collaborating with her, the volunteers who had been inspired by her hands-on approach, the beneficiaries who had come to see her as more than just a figurehead, all would now have to adjust to a very different style of royal patronage. Camilla rose from her chair with the satisfied air of someone who had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. "I do hope you'll take some time to compose yourself before dinner," she said with false concern. "Red eyes would clash terribly with the decor, and we wouldn't want to upset Charles with unnecessary dramatics." As Camilla swept from the room, leaving behind the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of her satisfied laughter, Catherine remained alone with her shattered dreams and the growing realization that her position within the royal family would never be the same. The woman who had once been hailed as the monarchy's greatest asset had been relegated to a supporting role in her own life, and the architect of her downfall was just getting started. The evening air carried a chill that seemed to penetrate the very stones of Buckingham Palace as Charles made his way through the corridors toward his private study. The events of the afternoon weighed heavily on his mind, though not for the reasons one might expect. The king's jaw was set in a hard line, his usual composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of emotions he had been suppressing for hours. Word had reached him about Camilla's visit to Catherine, and, more specifically, about the manner in which his wife had chosen to deliver the news of the patronage transfers. What was meant to be a discreet administrative change had become a scene of public humiliation, and Charles found himself caught between his loyalty to his wife and his growing awareness of the damage being done to his family's unity. His private secretary, Jonathan, waited nervously in the study with a stack of documents that required the king's attention. The man had served the royal family for over 15 years, and he had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his monarch's mood. The tight set of Charles's shoulders and the deliberate pace of his movements suggested a storm brewing beneath the surface. "Your Majesty," Jonathan began carefully, "I have a revised schedule for next week's engagements, and there are several matters regarding the upcoming state visit that require your immediate attention." Charles barely glanced at the papers as he moved to stand behind his massive oak desk. The surface was covered with the tools of kingship, official documents, sealed envelopes, photographs of state occasions, and family portraits that now seemed to mock him with their images of happier times. His hands clenched and unclenched as he struggled to process the reports he had been receiving throughout the day. "Tell me exactly what happened at Windsor," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made Jonathan shift uncomfortably. The private secretary cleared his throat nervously. "From what I understand, sir, the Queen Consort visited the Duchess of Cambridge to discuss the patronage arrangements that had been finalized this morning." The conversation was described as being somewhat emotional. "Emotional," Charles repeated, the words seeming to taste bitter in his mouth. "And would you care to elaborate on what exactly that means?" Jonathan's discomfort was palpable as he consulted his notes. Several staff members reported that the Duchess appeared quite distressed following the meeting. There were mentions of tears, and one housemaid indicated that the Duchess remained in the drawing room for nearly 2 hours after the Queen Consort departed. The image of Catherine, alone and crying in the very room where she had once laughed with his mother during happier family gatherings, struck Charles with unexpected force. He had known that the transition of duties would be difficult, but he had trusted Camilla to handle the situation with the discretion and sensitivity that such delicate matters required. Instead, it seemed that his wife had chosen to turn a necessary administrative change into a deliberate act of cruelty. Charles's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and his expression darkened further as he read the text from one of his security detail. William had been seen driving toward Windsor Castle at considerable speed, his usual composed demeanor replaced by visible agitation. The Prince of Wales had clearly learned about what had transpired with his wife, and Charles could already imagine the confrontation that was brewing. "Has the Queen Consort returned to her apartments?" Charles asked, though his tone suggested that this was not merely a question about scheduling. "Yes, sir. She mentioned that she had some correspondence to attend to and requested that dinner be delayed by half an hour. She seemed to be in quite good spirits." The casual mention of Camilla's good mood only served to fuel Charles's growing anger. While Catherine wept alone and William raced through the countryside in distress, his wife was contentedly writing letters as if nothing significant had occurred. The disconnect between the pain being caused and the satisfaction being displayed was more than Charles could tolerate. A sharp knock on the study door interrupted his brooding thoughts. Without waiting for permission to enter, William burst into the room with a fury that Charles had rarely seen from his usually diplomatic son. The Prince of Wales's face was flushed with anger, his hair disheveled from his hasty journey, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that reminded Charles uncomfortably of his own father during his more volatile moments. "What the hell did you do?" William demanded, abandoning all pretense of royal protocol in his rage. Charles straightened behind his desk, his own anger rising to meet his son's challenge. "I beg your pardon?" "Don't," William snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at his father. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. Catherine is devastated. Absolutely devastated. 8 years of work, 8 years of building relationships, and making a real difference, and you just hand it all over to Camilla without so much as a conversation." The raw pain in William's voice cut through Charles's defensive instincts and forced him to confront the reality of what had been done. He had convinced himself that the patronage transfers were a necessary step in establishing Camilla's role as queen consort, but he had failed to consider the human cost of his decision. More troubling still was the growing realization that Camilla had deliberately inflicted additional pain beyond what was necessary to accomplish their goals. "The arrangements were made for the good of the monarchy," Charles said stiffly, though his conviction was already wavering. "Camilla's position requires certain responsibilities, and it seemed logical to consolidate related charitable work under her oversight." William's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Logical? Is that what you call stripping away everything my wife has worked for and handing it to a woman who has spent her entire adult life undermining this family, and then having Camilla deliver the news like she was announcing a death sentence?" The comparison to a death sentence was not entirely inaccurate, Charles realized with growing unease. For Catherine, the loss of her patronages would feel like the death of her identity within the royal family. She had built her entire public persona around her charitable work, and without it, she would be reduced to little more than an ornamental figure at state occasions. Jonathan, sensing that he was witnessing a family crisis that far exceeded his security clearance, quietly gathered his documents and slipped from the room. The tension between father and son was thick enough to cut with a knife, and both men seemed to have forgotten that they were not alone. "Tell me exactly what Camilla said to her," Charles demanded, his voice taking on the tone of command that had cowed countless politicians and diplomats. William's expression grew even darker. "According to Catherine, your wife made it clear that this was just the beginning, that someone of Camilla's standing was better suited to handle important charitable work. She dismissed 8 years of dedicated service as if it were a hobby that had gotten out of hand." Each detail of Camilla's cruelty felt like a physical blow to Charles. He had known his wife could be sharp-tongued when she felt threatened, but he had never imagined she would be so deliberately vicious to a family member who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. The realization that he had enabled this attack by providing Camilla with the weapon she needed was almost too much to bear. She was supposed to explain the situation sensitively, Charles said weakly, though he was beginning to suspect that sensitivity had never been part of Camilla's plan. Sensitively? William's voice cracked with incredulous rage. She told Catherine that the children in the hospital would adapt to new leadership because they're remarkably resilient. She reduced my wife's relationship with cancer patients to a minor inconvenience that could be easily overcome. The callousness of Camilla's words about sick children hit Charles like a physical blow. Those were not the words of someone who misunderstood the situation or handled it poorly. They were the words of someone who took pleasure in causing pain. The realization that he had married a woman capable of such calculated cruelty toward vulnerable people and his own family members was almost too devastating to process. Charles sank into his chair as the full scope of what had occurred began to settle on his shoulders. He had thought he was making a strategic decision to strengthen the monarchy by giving Camilla more prominent roles. Instead, he had handed her the tools to systematically destroy the relationships and trust that Catherine had spent years building. Worse still, he had done so in a way that made it appear as though he personally endorsed Camilla's cruel methods. The mental health initiatives alone represent hundreds of hours of research and consultation. William continued relentlessly. Catherine didn't just take on those patronages. She revolutionized them. She brought real innovation and genuine compassion to work that had been stagnating for decades. And now Camilla gets to claim credit for all of that groundbreaking work while Catherine is expected to smile and pretend she's happy about it. The mention of innovation struck another painful chord for Charles. He remembered his own struggles as a young prince, fighting to bring new ideas and fresh perspectives to royal duties that had become trapped in outdated traditions. He had promised himself that he would encourage and support innovation from the next generation. Yet here he was actively destroying the very progress he should have been protecting. "I never intended for Catherine to be hurt," Charles said quietly, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized how inadequate they sounded. William's expression shifted from anger to something approaching disgust. "You never intended? Father, what did you think would happen when you secretly arranged to strip away everything that gives Catherine's life meaning, and then had Camilla deliver the news like she was announcing a conquest?" The accuracy of William's assessment was impossible to deny. Charles had approached the patronage transfers as if they were merely administrative details to be rearranged for maximum efficiency. He had failed to consider that for Catherine, these weren't just duties. They were relationships, commitments, and the foundation of her identity as a working royal. By treating her life's work as expendable, he had essentially declared that she herself was expendable. The way Camilla handled the situation was inappropriate, Charles admitted, though the word inappropriate seemed woefully inadequate to describe what had actually occurred. Inappropriate. William's voice rose again. "Father, your wife took pleasure in destroying mine." She smiled while explaining how she was taking away everything Catherine cares about. She threatened Catherine with consequences if she dared to object publicly. "That's not inappropriate. That's sadistic." The word sadistic hung in the air between them like an accusation that could not be taken back. Charles wanted to defend Camilla, to find some explanation for her behavior that would make it seem less monstrous, but the evidence was mounting against her. Every detail William shared painted a picture of someone who had not simply mishandled a difficult conversation, but had actively sought to maximize the pain she inflicted. Charles thought back to his conversations with Camilla about the patronage arrangements. She had been enthusiastic about taking on additional responsibilities, but he had attributed that enthusiasm to a desire to serve the monarchy more effectively. Now he wondered if her eagerness had been driven by something far more troubling, a desire to systematically undermine Catherine's position within the family. "What do you want me to do?" Charles asked, though he suspected that the damage might already be too severe to fully repair. William leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "I want you to reverse this decision immediately. I want you to return Catherine's patronages to her with a public apology for the confusion. And I want you to make it crystal clear to Camilla that if she ever speaks to my wife that way again, she'll be dealing with me directly." The demands were reasonable, but Charles knew that implementing them would require him to publicly admit that he had made a serious error in judgment. More troubling still, it would require him to confront Camilla about behavior that revealed disturbing aspects of her character that he had been trying to ignore for years. As if summoned by their discussion, The sound of Camilla's laughter drifted through the palace corridors. She was clearly entertaining someone in her private sitting room, her voice bright and cheerful, as if this had been just another ordinary day. The contrast between her obvious contentment and the devastation she had left in her wake was more than Charles could stomach. The royal household had rarely experienced such tension as what permeated the palace corridors in the days following the confrontation between Charles and William. Staff members moved with the careful precision of people walking through a minefield, aware that the slightest misstep could trigger an explosion of anger from any member of the fractured family. The very air seemed to crackle with unresolved conflict and suppressed emotions. Catherine had retreated to Anmer Hall, the family's country residence, ostensibly to spend time with the children, but actually to escape the suffocating atmosphere of royal life that had suddenly become unbearable. She moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost of her former self, going through the motions of motherhood while battling the devastation that threatened to consume her entirely. The children, sensitive to their mother's distress, despite her attempts to shield them, had grown quiet and clingy, adding another layer of guilt to Catherine's already overwhelming emotional burden. William divided his time between supporting his wife and engaging in increasingly heated discussions with palace officials about the possibility of reversing his father's decision. Every conversation seemed to hit the same impenetrable wall. The king had made his choice, and the machinery of royal protocol was already in motion to implement the changes. Press releases had been prepared, new stationery had been ordered, and meetings had been scheduled to introduce Camilla to the leadership of Catherine's former patronages. Meanwhile, Charles found himself caught in a web of his own making, struggling to reconcile his love for his son and daughter-in-law with his loyalty to his wife and his commitment to the decisions he had made as king. Sleep eluded him as he wrestled with the growing realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood both the impact of his choices and the character of the woman he had married. The palace, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a prison where every room held echoes of happier times that might never return. Camilla, seemingly oblivious to the chaos she had unleashed, continued with her daily routine as if nothing had changed. She attended her scheduled engagements with renewed enthusiasm, already discussing plans for her expanded role with her private secretary. The gleam in her eyes when she spoke about her new patronages suggested a satisfaction that went far beyond professional accomplishment. She had achieved something she had been working toward for years: the systematic displacement of Catherine as the most influential female member of the royal family. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine family dinner at Windsor Castle. Charles had insisted that everyone attend, hoping that the familiar setting and shared meal might begin to heal the wounds that had been opened. Instead, the evening became a showcase for just how deeply the family had been fractured by recent events. Catherine arrived looking pale and drawn, her usual warmth replaced by a careful politeness that felt more distant than outright hostility. She spoke only when directly addressed, her responses brief and carefully neutral. William sat beside her like a guard dog, ready to spring into action at the first sign of further attack on his wife. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, seemed confused by the unusual tension, but had been coached to be on their best behavior. Camilla swept into the dining room with the confidence of someone who believed she had emerged victorious from a difficult battle. She wore her finest jewelry and an expression of serene satisfaction that made Catherine's careful composure seem even more heartbreaking by comparison. The Queen Consort's greeting to Catherine was warm and effusive, a performance of concerned family unity that everyone present recognized as completely false. "My dear Catherine," Camilla gushed as she took her seat, "you look lovely this evening. I do hope you're feeling better after our little chat the other day. Change can be so overwhelming, but I'm sure you'll find new interests to pursue once you've had time to adjust." The patronizing tone made William's fork clatter against his plate with barely controlled fury, while Catherine's face went even paler. Charles watched the exchange with growing horror, realizing that Camilla was either completely oblivious to the pain she had caused or was deliberately choosing to inflict more damage under the guise of friendly concern. "Perhaps we should focus on the children's school activities," Charles suggested hastily, desperate to steer the conversation away from dangerous territory. But Camilla was not to be deterred from her moment of triumph. "Oh, but I'm so excited to share my plans for the new patronages," she continued with false enthusiasm. "I've been thinking about some significant changes that might really revitalize these organizations. Fresh perspectives can be so valuable, don't you think?" The word fresh was delivered with particular emphasis, a not-so-subtle suggestion that Catherine's approach had become stale and ineffective. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and for a moment it seemed she might simply get up and leave the table. William's jaw was clenched so tightly that it appeared he might crack his teeth. "Camilla," Charles said warningly, finally, beginning to recognize the deliberate cruelty in his wife's behavior. "What?" Camilla asked with wide-eyed innocence. "I'm simply trying to include Catherine in the conversation about the future of these wonderful organizations. After all, her input might be valuable as we transition to new leadership." The casual dismissal of Catherine as former leadership was the final straw for William. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone jump. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Catherine, children, we're leaving." "William, please," Charles began, but his son cut him off with a look of such fury that the king actually stepped back. "No," William said sharply. "I won't sit here and watch your wife torture mine for her own amusement. Catherine has done nothing to deserve this treatment, and I won't expose our children to this toxic behavior any longer." Camilla's mask of innocence slipped slightly, revealing a flash of anger at being challenged so directly. "Really, William, you're being quite dramatic. I was simply trying to have a civilized conversation about family matters." "Civilized?" Catherine spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel that surprised everyone. "Is that what you call systematically destroying 8 years of work and then gloating about it?" The directness of Catherine's response seemed to catch Camilla off guard. The queen consort had clearly expected her victim to remain silent and submissive, absorbing whatever punishment was deemed appropriate without fighting back. The fact that Catherine was finally defending herself appeared to anger Camilla more than anything William had said. "I think you're forgetting your place in this family," Camilla said coldly, her pretense of warmth finally abandoned completely. "Charles is the king, and his decisions are final. Your feelings about those decisions are ultimately irrelevant." The brutal honesty of the statement sent shockwaves through the room. Even Charles looked stunned by his wife's naked display of cruelty. The children, who had been trying to eat their dinner despite the tension, looked up with confused and frightened expressions. George, at 10 years old, was beginning to understand that something terrible was happening to his mother, even if he couldn't fully comprehend the details. "My feelings may be irrelevant to you," Catherine said, standing slowly and gathering what remained of her dignity, "but the people whose lives I've touched over the past 8 years might disagree. The children in the hospitals, the families dealing with mental health crises, the women rebuilding their lives after abuse. They might think their feelings matter more than your ambitions." The comparison between Catherine's genuine concern for others and Camilla's self-serving motivations hung in the air like an accusation that could not be disputed. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than just a family argument. They were seeing the fundamental difference between someone who viewed royal duty as service and someone who saw it as an opportunity for personal glorification. Camilla's face flushed with anger at being so directly challenged. "You sanctimonious little girl," she snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "You waltz into this family with your doe-eyed innocence and act like you invented charity work. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, and I don't need lectures from someone who thinks a few photo opportunities make her Mother Teresa." The viciousness of the attack, left everyone momentarily speechless. Charles stared at his wife, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, while William moved protectively toward Catherine. The children looked frightened by the sudden explosion of adult anger, and Charlotte began to cry softly. "That's enough," Charles said finally, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "Camilla, you will apologize immediately." But Camilla was beyond caring about appearances or consequences. Years of resentment and jealousy had finally found their outlet, and she seemed determined to inflict maximum damage while she had the opportunity. "Apologize?" She laughed harshly. "For what? For stating the obvious? For refusing to pretend that taking pictures with sick children makes someone a saint?" The reference to sick children as mere photo opportunities revealed a level of callousness that shocked even those who had grown accustomed to Camilla's sharp tongue. Catherine's work with hospitalized children had always been conducted with genuine warmth and minimal publicity, often involving private visits that never appeared in the press. To reduce those relationships to calculated image management showed a fundamental misunderstanding of Catherine's character and motivations. "You're talking about children who are fighting for their lives," Catherine said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to fall. "Children who find comfort in having someone care about them, someone who remembers their names and asks about their treatments. If you think that's a photo opportunity, then you understand nothing about what this role is supposed to mean." The dignity with which Catherine defended her work only seemed to inflame Camilla's anger further. "Oh, spare me the noble martyr routine," she sneered. "We all know you're only upset because your little kingdom is being taken away. All those people hanging on your every word, treating you like you're something special. That's what you really can't bear to lose." The accusation was so far from the truth that it seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Everyone who had ever worked with Catherine knew that she genuinely disliked being the center of attention and much preferred to let the people she helped tell their own stories. Her approach to royal duties had always been about amplifying other voices rather than promoting her own image. Charles watched this character assassination of his daughter-in-law with growing horror and anger. The woman he had married was systematically destroying one of the most beloved members of the royal family, based on nothing more than jealousy and spite. Every word Camilla spoke revealed new depths of cruelty that he had never suspected existed beneath her carefully maintained public persona. "I think you need to stop talking," Charles said to Camilla, his voice carrying a warning that she chose to ignore. "What?" Camilla demanded, turning her fury on her husband. "Because I'm telling the truth for once? Because I'm not willing to pretend that Little Miss Perfect is actually the saint everyone makes her out to be?" The situation had spiraled completely out of control, with family members saying things that could never be unsaid and revealing truths about themselves that would fundamentally change their relationships forever. The children watched in frightened silence as the adults in their lives tore each other apart, their security and understanding of family unity crumbling before their eyes. The aftermath of the devastating dinner at Windsor Castle reverberated through the royal household like an earthquake whose tremors refused to settle. In the days that followed, Charles found himself confronting truths about his marriage and his family that he had been avoiding for far too long. The mask had finally been torn away from Camilla's face, revealing not the devoted partner he thought he had married, but someone whose capacity for cruelty toward his family members was both shocking and unforgivable. Catherine retreated even deeper into herself, spending long hours walking alone through the gardens at Anmer Hall, while William struggled to balance his roles as husband, father, and heir to the throne. The children, traumatized by witnessing such raw adult hostility, required careful counseling to help them process what they had seen and heard. Professional child psychologists were quietly brought in to ensure that George, Charlotte, and Louis would not suffer lasting damage for being exposed to Camilla's vicious attack on their mother. The media, sensing that something significant was happening within the royal family, began circling like vultures. Palace officials worked frantically to maintain the facade of family unity while dealing with increasingly persistent questions about why Catherine had suddenly withdrawn from all public engagements. The official line about personal time with family fooled no one, and speculation about a serious rift within the monarchy began to appear in newspapers around the world. Charles spent sleepless nights pacing his private study, replaying every moment of that disastrous evening and trying to understand how he had so completely misjudged the situation. The woman who had comforted him through his darkest moments, who had stood by him through decades of scandal and public criticism, had revealed herself to be capable of breathtaking cruelty toward the most vulnerable members of his family. The realization that he had enabled and empowered such behavior was almost too much to bear. On the third day after the confrontation, Charles received an unexpected visitor. Elizabeth Finch, the director of one of the children's hospitals that Catherine had worked with for years, requested an urgent private meeting. She arrived at Buckingham Palace with the grim determination of someone who had witnessed enough human suffering to recognize when unnecessary pain was being inflicted on good people. "Your Majesty," Elizabeth began without preamble, "I need to speak with you about the proposed changes to our patronage arrangements. The children at our hospital are asking when Princess Catherine will visit again, and, frankly, I don't know what to tell them." Charles gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing, unable to find comfort in any position as guilt gnawed at his conscience. "I understand this transition may be challenging, but I'm sure the Queen Consort will provide excellent support for your organization." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "With respect, sir, this isn't about organizational support. This is about relationships that have taken years to build and trust that may never be repaired. Princess Catherine doesn't just visit our hospital. She knows our patients by name. She remembers their treatments, their fears, their small victories. Yesterday, a 7-year-old girl named Sophie asked when her princess would come back to read to her before her next surgery. The image of a frightened child asking for Catherine hit Charles like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the political implications of the patronage transfers that he had failed to consider the human cost to the people who depended on Catherine's genuine care and attention. "Surely the children will adjust to new arrangements," Charles said weakly, though he immediately recognized the echo of Camilla's dismissive word from their confrontation with Catherine. "Will they?" Elizabeth's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades caring for critically ill children. Princess Catherine visited Sophie every month for 2 years while she battled leukemia. She celebrated when Sophie went into remission, and she was there when the cancer returned. Sophie doesn't understand politics or patronage arrangements. She only knows that the person who brought her comfort in her darkest moments has suddenly disappeared. The weight of individual relationships that would be destroyed by his decision began to settle on Charles's shoulders like a crushing burden. Each patronage Catherine held represented hundreds of personal connections, thousands of moments of genuine human connection that had provided comfort, hope, and healing to people in their most vulnerable states. "I received a call this morning from the mental health clinic in Birmingham," Elizabeth continued relentlessly. "A teenage boy who had been working with Princess Catherine on his recovery from severe depression attempted suicide last night. His mother said he had been counting on their scheduled meeting next week as motivation to keep fighting." The stark reality of the consequences hit Charles like a sledgehammer to the chest. His administrative decision had real-world implications that extended far beyond royal protocols and family dynamics. People were being hurt, relationships were being severed, and trust that had taken years to build was being destroyed overnight. "There are procedures in place," Charles began, but Elizabeth cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Procedures don't heal broken hearts, Your Majesty." Princess Catherine brought something special to her work, genuine compassion that couldn't be faked or manufactured. She didn't just show up for photo opportunities. She invested her heart in these relationships, and the people she worked with could feel the difference. As Elizabeth detailed more examples of the human cost of his decision, Charles found himself thinking about his own experiences with charity work. He remembered his mother's approach to royal duties, the careful balance between public service and personal connection that had made Elizabeth II such a beloved figure. Catherine had embodied that same balance, bringing fresh energy and authentic compassion to roles that could easily become mere ceremonial obligations. The meeting with Elizabeth was followed by similar visits from representatives of Catherine's other patronages. Each conversation revealed new layers of damage that his decision would cause, new relationships that would be severed, new trust that would be broken. The director of the women's shelter spoke about abuse survivors who had specifically requested to work with Catherine because her own experiences with public scrutiny had given her unique insights into recovery from trauma. By the end of the week, Charles felt as though he was drowning in the evidence of his own poor judgment. The decision that had seemed so logical in the abstract had become a humanitarian disaster in practice. Worse still, every report of damage caused seemed to increase Camilla's satisfaction with the outcome. She spoke enthusiastically about her plans for modernizing Catherine's former patronages, seemingly oblivious to the pain her takeover was causing. The breaking point came when Charles learned that one of the youth mentorship programs Catherine had founded was considering closing entirely rather than continue without her involvement. The teenagers in the program had specifically requested that it end rather than continue with someone new, saying that they couldn't imagine trusting anyone else with their stories and struggles. That evening, Charles made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of his family's future. He summoned his private secretary and instructed him to begin the process of reversing the patronage transfers immediately. There would be public embarrassment, political complications, and personal consequences, but he could no longer justify the human cost of his original decision. The conversation with Camilla was even more devastating than Charles had anticipated. When he informed her that the patronage arrangements would be returning to their previous status, her reaction revealed depths of selfishness and vindictiveness that he had never imagined possible. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said coldly, her mask of supportive wife finally abandoned completely. "That little girl has manipulated you into believing she's some kind of saint, but I know what she really is, a calculating opportunist who uses other people's misery to make herself look good." The viciousness of the attack on Catherine's character was more than Charles could stomach. "Catherine has never asked for any of this to be reversed," he said quietly. "She hasn't even spoken to me since that dinner. This decision is based on evidence of the real harm being caused to real people." "Harm?" Camilla laughed bitterly. "The only harm being done is to my position in this family. You're allowing a spoiled princess to override the King of England because she threw a tantrum about sharing her toys." The complete mischaracterization of Catherine's response, her quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation, revealed just how distorted Camilla's perception of reality had become. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that other people might be motivated by something other than personal ambition and the desire for public adulation. "This conversation is over," Charles said firmly. "The decision has been made, and it will not be reversed." As he walked away from his wife, for what he suspected might be the last time they would speak as partners rather than adversaries, Charles felt the full weight of the choices he had made and their consequences for everyone he claimed to love. The monarchy would survive this crisis, but the family that embodied it had been fundamentally changed by the revelation of truths that could never be unknown or forgotten. In the quiet of his study, Charles drafted a personal letter to Catherine, not as king to subject, but as father-in-law to daughter-in-law, apologizing for the pain he had caused and acknowledging the extraordinary grace with which she had endured attacks that would have broken a lesser person. He knew that words alone could never fully repair the damage that had been done, but he hoped that acknowledging the truth might be the first step toward healing wounds that ran deeper than anyone had imagined possible. The letter would be delivered the next morning, along with the official restoration of all of Catherine's patronages and a public statement praising her dedication and compassion. It was a small gesture compared to the magnitude of the harm that had been inflicted, but it represented Charles's commitment to ensuring that genuine service and authentic compassion would always be valued above personal ambition and calculated cruelty in the royal family he led.